Hi there. My name is Maxine Holt, and I lead the cybersecurity research at Omdia. I'm delighted to be joined by Cabello. Cabello, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Maxine. Hello, everyone. My name is Cabello Magwane, and I'm with Vodacom Business, and I lead the digital cloud application transformation and cybersecurity business within Vodacom.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you. So for everybody, thank you very much for joining this fireside chat. Vodacom and Omdia have worked together on some research into the state of cybersecurity in South Africa and the wider Africa region. So we've produced a range of resources for everybody, and these resources are based on qualitative and quantitative insights, and we're delighted to be able to share some of these insights in our fireside chat today. I want to talk by discussing digital economies, kind of the value of digital in society. We hear so much about it, but can you kind of summarize what this means, please, from your perspective?
Yeah, Maxine, thanks for the question. And I think in the last decade, at least in the African context, we've seen just the acceleration of digital adoption, where organizations across industry sectors have adopted new ways of reaching their customers and new ways of reaching markets using or enabled by technology. And this accelerated pace of adopting technologies that aim to establish online presence, foster e-commerce, or remote ways of engaging and interacting with their respective constituencies or customers, or different organizations from a business to business perspective. It has seen a significant upshot, particularly even during and post COVID, where we saw a phenomenal adoption of digital technologies, at the very least, to just help people to continue to do the things that they need to do to keep thriving, or businesses to pivot in the context of lockdowns, with hybrid ways of working, and this accelerated pace of adopting digital technologies is also something that businesses are embracing, because it gives them scale. It gives them also the ability to be more resilient to emerging new entrants into markets. The so-called Uberization of industries is something that's become quite prolific, and therefore it behooves industries and organizations that want to sustain longevity, but also increase their growth, to consider these digital technologies and platforms. And with that, obviously, comes with its own set of challenges and complexities. But certainly in the African context, there's something that's familiarly quoted to say, to some degree, in some countries, Africa might have missed the Industrial Revolution, and there's an opportunity to leapfrog in terms of the digital revolution. And by and large, if you look at mobile technologies and mobile-driven services, they've seen an exponential adoption across our markets, particularly with a young burgeoning population.
And I think it's kind of really, really interesting to think about that kind of resilience piece as well. You mentioned resilience, and I think it's we think about digital resilience at Omdia as kind of the capacity of an organization to kind of maintain continuous operations. You've got to be able to continuously provide those services. You called it the Uberization of industries. And absolutely, people expect to be able to order food at 3 a.m. for some reason, but that's absolutely what they expect. So you need to be resilient there, but you also need to be able to capitalize on those innovations and opportunities capabilities there as well. So I think that's really important, and we can see what happens as well when resilience isn't there. So if we think about Digital Dependence Day, there was a lot of outages in July the world over, July just last month, 2024, and that demonstrated challenges with digital resilience there as well. So, we firmly believe at Omdia that cyber resilience is a key component of digital resilience. So, you've got to have that digital resilience to be able to that cyber resilience, to be able to provide that digital resilience as well. I'd like to bring in as well kind of the things that cyber professionals are thinking about, because when we look at kind of the how well organizations have equipped themselves for cybersecurity. I think there are some challenges there, if I'm being perfectly honest. I mean, organizations know it's important, but how many have actually done something about it? And it's a decent number, don't get me wrong, but there are still a lot of organizations that have got some significant holes in their capabilities when it comes to being able to manage security, identity, and privacy in an organization. So, we do know, for example, from Omdia's cybersecurity decision maker survey of 2024, we've got 90% of organizations that think cyber threats have stayed the same or got worse over the past 2 years, and actually 62% overall think it's got worse. So that's nearly 2/3 of cyber professionals thinking that security, the threats from a cyber landscape are actually getting worse, so they've got worse over the past couple of years. There's so many organizations that are suffering, so many security incidents and breaches. It's a real challenge. And from the interviews that we did, I mentioned up front that we did some qualitative interviews. A few people talked about the kind of the minimal regulatory framework, or the kind of patchy regulatory framework in the region. So that does to some extent make the region an attractive target for cyber attacks. And yes, there's increased recognition, but that actually still needs to be prioritized. We still need better priorities for security as well. And I so often hear comments from individuals when they're saying, well, why would anybody attack my organization? What's so interesting about the organization that I work for? And I really think that the reality is, actually, you should be thinking about why wouldn't they want to attack you? And there's lots and lots going on in South Africa when it comes to cyber issues. So what sort of things are you hearing, Kabelo, about the cyber issues in the region?
I would agree with you by and large, Maxine, in that we've seen an upsurge in the prevalence, of cyber attacks, particularly ransomware attacks. I think, in tandem with or propagated through, your common phishing attacks, to deliver these payloads into organizations and propagate the actual, threat act. There are various figures, and you would be expert in this, but it's primarily driven by, the accelerated adoption of digital, without necessarily, as you mentioned earlier, thinking about the resilience that one needs to consider in adopting digital platforms and digital technologies. That transformation of, cybersecurity being synonymous with digital adoption, I think still needs to take place. It's kind of like, if you think about it, when you are living in a particular locale, and of course, if you're going to move to this location, the first thing you want to do is do a bit of an assessment of your environment, and in considering the prevalence of crime, et cetera. But together with that, once you understand your situation, you also want to start putting in the basic security elements. You might want to put a boundary wall around you. You might want to make sure that your house can be secured, right? And you don't leave your windows open, as an example.
Yeah.
And so having that presence of mind to say you do not want to present yourself as somebody that is easy pickings for the let's call it opportunistic threat actors, versus those people who are more proactive, who will surveil you and before they decide on particularly breaching your security environment in any way whatsoever. And in the digital world, we see the same types of behavior, right? There's a big prevalence in social engineering, people putting all sorts of information in the digital platforms, employees within organizations also doing the same, without necessarily considering also what vulnerabilities they might unduly expose the organization or themselves to people who are expert at those types of practices of surveilling and monitoring behaviors, so that they can then propagate a threat against a particular organization. So certainly it's something that's we've seen a lot of incidences both in the public sector and in the private sector. There are well-known cases and documented cases of huge ransomware attacks where people's confidential information or so-called personal identifiable information has been compromised. And in one instance, it's an organization that basically deals with data and uses that data for different industries to help those industries, like in insurance, for instance, around risk assessment. Was hacked. In another instance, a big government, an agency that deals with pensions was also recently hit with ransomware attacks. So it's all over. There is no particular industry that is immune to this. And so what's also quite interesting is that these threat actors are actually targeting the high-prized industries, the heavily regulated industry for the richness of the data repositories they have, right? Healthcare, government, financial services, etc., are prime targets. Even telecoms companies are actually prime targets for it. I'm not sure from your perspective, Maxine, if this resonates and what you've seen based on the research that you've conducted recently.
Oh, absolutely agree. I mean, the issues around kind of, I think personally identifiable information, the PII that you mentioned, it's got personal in the name, but it's a very personal thing. I think when that's stolen, and as you quite rightly point out, Kabelo, some of these big organizations have the data that that the attackers want for whatever reason, generally for financial gain, but they do. So we have to be able to protect that PII, and that's kind of the confidentiality component. But we have to remember things like integrity and availability as well. We have to be able to protect. To be able to protect information, our data, our systems, to make sure they're available. That's the resilience piece again, as well as confidential, and they're holding integrity, so they're not, the information isn't changed. So I do think that the regulatory demands are going to grow within organizations as well. I just wanted to make the point about security, because I think it can seem, before I entered the security industry, I've been in tech all my life, but all my working life, should I say, but from security, that's something I came to partway through my career, and it seemed very daunting at the time when you're kind of looking from the outside in. But I think, it's it's really important to not be frightened by it, to not feel concerned by it, and you're actually focusing on kind of, let's just take baby steps and get going with it. So just things like training people, ensure that your employees and others know what's important from a security perspective. You think about security, you mentioned this right up front, Cabela, about kind of launching new digital products, but not thinking about the security of them as well. Absolutely get that much sooner into the cycle. And by doing just small things like that, it really can help to prioritize cybersecurity in the organization. So just, sorry, go ahead, Cabela.
How easy is it to address security, Maxine? As you correctly point out, a lot of people find this subject quite daunting, especially given so many of these security vendors out there. What should organizations be thinking about? Where do they even begin in trying to address this topic?
Well, I do think the first thing to do is just not be frightened of it, just to think, right, okay, I'm going to go into it and I'm going to think, don't ignore it, because that is the worst thing I think that you can do. It's a wonderful industry. People are there to help as well. And it like you say, it can seem daunting, but I do think that there's lots and lots of help there. So you can look for, I don't know any organization with a security function, which of course is every organization, has got some level of security somewhere, and none of them work alone. They don't go it alone. So you mentioned that there's a lot of vendors in the market. There are absolutely a lot of vendors who are there to help, but also a lot of service providers. There's a lot of free resources out there as well that can just give you those initial steps to start to make inroads into security. So I think that would be one of my key things is number one, not to ignore it, and number two, don't try and go it alone. Ask for help, get the help, because there are resources out there. And the security industry is wonderful because everybody's a community, if you will. People do want to help each other. There's, that for me is unique in the world of tech, that it's not just, it's not super competitive in that way. Everybody's trying to fight the threat actors, because they end up causing such disruption, which is just not good for anybody. So, by collecting, our intelligence together and our insights and help, I think that's a really good thing to do.
So, Maxine, you've articulated, in such a comprehensive way how organizations should be thinking about AI in the digital evolution space. But we've got another evolution that's come in and taken the world by storm, and this is artificial intelligence, and particularly with large language models. And this presents a whole set of other challenges around, digital resilience. In addition to what you've already mentioned, what would be the key, things to think about and key considerations in organizations securing the information in the advent of the artificial intelligence evolution?
I think AI, as with any technology, can be used for nefarious means as well as positive means. So I often think of AI in three buckets, and you mentioned LLMs, large language models, and kind of the generative AI that comes out of that. So if I think about AI for nefarious use, the use by threat actors, maybe they're using generative AI to write very sophisticated phishing emails. I've seen some of those knocking around. Maybe they're using AI to create deep fakes. I've seen some very impressive deep fakes as well. So that's one use of AI, but it can be used for good as well. So you can think about the use of artificial intelligence in security products and services. That's been around actually for about a decade, I would say, being used comprehensively in the SOC, in the security operations operations center. We're also seeing increased use of generative AI in the SOC as tier one support, if you will, so to help the overworked SOC analysts in creating that tier one support for their customers. But then the third area, which you alluded to as well, Cabello, is about the security of AI. And this, I think, has been not forgotten, but hasn't taken as much prominence as the capabilities of AI. And the security of AI is thinking about the data and the models that and the tooling that we're using to create, to create advances in technology, but we're not necessarily providing the integrity for that data that we need to do. And we need to make sure that data that feeds into large language models or whatever it might be to create AI algorithms is actually, it does have integrity. Otherwise, it's going to produce spurious results. And we really don't want to see that, because that can send organizations and individuals down the wrong path completely. So I do think that is a third area that perhaps hasn't been developed as much as it might be, but it's something that we should all absolutely have on our agenda.
Maxine, I think just in that same vein, we've seen some major outages of late, which the genesis of which was through security related matters. In such instances, that for the customers and the industries that affected, what would be your guidance and your advice to them?
So what I would say for those is, there is no organization, again, that operates without third parties coming into their systems, whether they're accessing data or they're accessing systems. There's no organization that operates without that happening. So you have to ensure that whenever an organization is given the opportunity to do updates at whatever level it might be, that you've got, there's a strong, trusted relationship with them, and that you have processes and procedures in place to be able to deal with any issues that might come up, such as the ones that came up in July. And that instance is not on its own. There are plenty of others. It's just that one caused such a huge problem. Of course, it wasn't a cyber attack. It was a software update, so that could happen in other parts of the software stack as well. But it is about having those relationships and knowing who and what has access to your systems to be able to do those updates. So sometimes things just can't be completely avoided, unfortunately, but know who's got access, I think is a really important point.
Thank you so much, Maxine. And my key takeaways from this, conversation and the research that you've highlighted is that we need to face cybersecurity head on. It's not an if, but maybe subject. It's a must.
Yeah.
And with the increased adoption of digital, to be able to be digitally resilient as you operate in the digital space, this is a super important subject and one that needs to be considered synonymously. I also think that you've made some very important points around, employee awareness and training. It's often said that, people are the weakest link in the security chain. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And knowing what obligations, legal, regulatory, and otherwise, may be required to be compliant, to operate in the cyberspace in a secure fashion, I think was one of the key things that certainly, and if you think about the context, of the Africa continent, in many cases, I think we have to accelerate the maturing of our legal and regulatory framework in line with the breakneck speed of the digital evolution. And of course, last but not least, as you said, how do you partner effectively with third parties and service providers and leveraging those expertise? As you said, it's a broad church, it's a broad community. Finding the right supporters and partners and partnerships to help you on the cybersecurity and digital journey becomes super, super important. I don't know if you have any closing comments, parting shots from your end, but certainly these are my key takeaways.
Yeah, I think they're good ones. I think they're really key points, Cabello. I think the regulatory framework will grow. I think you're spot on with that. Train your people. Train your people. It's a really valuable thing to do, because people make mistakes, and if they don't know that they're making a mistake, then you absolutely need to have that training done. So yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said there. I think it's all spot on, and I think there's lots of help out there, including the resources that are available from this research that Vodacom and Omdia did together. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine, Maxine.